Before I begin today, I would like to announce something. You may have noticed this. I may sound a little further away, and the screen is a little dark. This is how it will go because I've noticed that the light in my room is not the best for someone's eyes. And I tend to have shaky camera angles. So, from now on, this is how it will go. My apologies, but enjoy today's chapter of the High Druid's Blade. Chapter 9. It was Sebek who brought Paxson the message, and who delivered him to the door of the room where Aefinglo Elecidal waited. But then the young Druid told him he was to enter alone, and left him there. Paxson watched the others back recede down the hallway, not quite believing he was left alone for this meeting. But then he took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in, Paxson," the Ardrice called out from inside. He entered and found her waiting in the company of another druid, a man of ordinary size and appearance, a Southlander by the look of him, one possessed of eyes that were of two different colors, one deep blue and the other lavender. The druid nodded to him but said nothing. "Close the door, please," the Ardrice ordered. He did so and stepped up to where she sat at her writing desk, its small surface cluttered with papers of all sizes, shapes, and colors. "This is Starks," she said. "I've asked him to travel to the Westland, to Grimpin Ward, where there is evidence of magic in use. I want you to go with him." Paxson didn't know what to say. As his protector? That, but mostly as a student assigned to learn from a more seasoned member of the Order. "I have spoken to Oost, and he tells me you are well along in your training with weapons. He thinks you are ready for some practical experience. This particular journey should suffice. The magic the scribe has discovered is not large, and is being applied in a haphazard manner. Whoever has it likely found it by accident, and has no real idea how to use it, or perhaps even of the danger it poses. To the finder, this is mostly an interesting toy. Starks will show you how to find such magic, and how to retrieve it without calling attention to yourselves or causing harm to anyone else." "Will I be allowed to take my sword with me?" he asked. She nodded. "But you are not to use it unless Starks tells you to, or either of you is threatened in a way that absolutely requires it." "Absolutely, Paxson. Do you understand why?" "Because I'm still learning about magic. Because I don't have enough practice with it. Because every time you use magic, you risk someone finding out about it. The druids are not the only ones who scour the four lands in search of magic. Others, many not friendly to the Order, and not respectful of its goals, hunt it too. We don't always know who those people are or where they can be found, so we use caution in employing magic and avoid invoking it whenever we can." "I'll be careful," he promised. "I'm counting on it," She gave him a brief smile. "Now go along with Starks, and let him explain more about the details. You'll leave tomorrow." She went back to sorting through her papers, and Paxton went out the door with the other Druid. As they walked side by side down the hallway, Starks asked, "How long have you been here, Paxton? It's been a while, hasn't it?" "A little more than 2 months. Working with Boost the entire time." "Mostly in the afternoons. Sebek teaches me about magic in the mornings, about how it works and what to look out for when using it." "How long have you been here?" The other shrugged. "Maybe 6 years. I'm impressed by the fact that you had a run-in with Arcanon and lived to tell about it." Paxton suppressed a grin. "I was lucky. The sword's magic saved me." "How do you know about this?" Starks gave him a look, his bland expression shifting into something resembling amusement. "Everyone knows, Paxton. Everyone knew, even before you arrived. The Druids keep few secrets from one another." The Highlander frowned, looking off in the distance. "Apparently." Starks laughed. "You didn't think there wouldn't be talk of you before you arrived, did you? Not when you are the first paladin selected by the Ard race in 5 years. You didn't know that, didn't you?" Paxton managed a sheepish smile. "I think Sebek said something about it. I guess the one before me didn't last. Didn't and shouldn't have. You, at least, seem better settled and certainly more seasoned. Oost talked too, you know, even if you don't see him doing so. He likes you." "Does he?" Paxton was genuinely surprised. "I always believed he was pretty much just putting up with me." Starks came to a halt. "If he didn't like you, or think you were adequately prepared for it, you wouldn't be going with me. You can be certain of that." He started away, then he turned back. "You should also know that I asked for you to come with me. That ought to tell you something." A moment later, he was gone. They set out at dawn, flying the familiar 2-masted clipper crewed by a pair of troll guards. One of them took the helm, and the other managed the lines and light sheaths. Starks showed no interest in helping out. Indeed, he placed himself squarely in front of the pilot box upon a folded blanket, his black robes wrapped about him, and disappeared into a book he had carried aboard. After stowing his bag, Paxton stood around for a bit, trying to decide what to do. He didn't want to interrupt Starks and the trolls seemed fine without him. Finally, he moved to the bow of the clipper and started working through the list of exercises that Ustmandara had given him to loosen up every afternoon before weapons practice. But he was free to use his own sword now, and he did. The blade felt so much lighter and more balanced in his hands than the wooden model he used in field practice that he practically flew through his exercises. When he finished the first run, he drank some water from the deck barrel and began again. 2 hours later, he felt hot and vaguely lightheaded, perhaps from doing so much at a higher altitude. In any case, Starks told him to break it off and have some lunch. They sat together with tins of hot vegetable stew and bread, and washed it down with ale. Surreptitiously, Paxton watched the other man, trying to make sense of him. He seemed so removed from everything, as if he was always somewhere else in his mind. He showed no obvious concern for the mission on which they had been sent, having not once bothered to discuss it with his companion. Finally, Paxton said, Do you think we'll have any trouble with getting this magic away from whoever it has? Whoever has it? Stark smiled. You want to know why I don't seem worried about it? Maybe why I don't even seem interested? It's just the way I am. I don't like to think too far ahead about what's waiting around the corner. I like to be prepared, but not troubled. We've got 2 days before we reach Grimpen Ward. There is no point in fussing about it until then. Paxson frowned. I don't know if I could do that. Most can't. Other druids wonder about me. I hear them talking sometimes when they think I don't hear them. But I've always been different from most of them anyway. What do you mean? Paxson said. I'm from the deep Southland, from Stern. Not too many raised that far inside the Federation find their way to Paranor. But you did. I wasn't satisfied with what the Federation had to offer. I didn't accept that I wasn't supposed to use magic if I could manage to do so. That sort of rule feels artificial. So I went north and asked the Druids if they would take me. Some of them wouldn't have, I suspect. But the Ardrice did. She never questioned me, never asked for a reason, and never suggested I wasn't to be trusted because of where I came from. She worked with me personally for a time, and then gave me over to Isaturan. That was the daunting. He was very precise, very demanding, a tough teacher. But I came through, and now I am a full-fledged member of the Order. He gave Paxson a look. You know, you should give some thought to joining the Order, too. It might be possible, once you've proved your value as a paladin. I didn't come to Paranor to join the Order, Paxson said quickly. I don't think it's like me. Starks rose and stretched. Give it time. You might not know what's for you. Give it time. You might not know what's for you this soon. And don't underrate yourself. You can do and be anything you want. He went off for a nap, leaving Paxson to clean up the lunch which the Highlander set about doing. At least he was performing a useful task. They sat down for the night, halfway across the turfing, in a copse of conifers that offered some protection from winds that had picked up late in the day and suggested a change in the weather. As the pair ate dinner with the trolls, they could feel a sudden rise in the temperature. We're going to get some rain, Starks declared from the firelight reflecting from his different colored eyes. A lot of rain. They went below decks to sleep that night, heeding the Druid's warning, and by midnight the rain was hammering against the sloop's hull, and the vessel was rocking and straining against her anchor ropes, buffeted by the heavy winds. The motion was familiar to Paxson, who had been aboard airships all his life, so he slept undisturbed until one of the anchor ropes broke, and the clipper began slamming against the trunks of the trees in which she had been moored. So, throwing off his blankets, he went topside with the trolls and down the rope ladder to fasten fresh ropes in place to re-secure the ship. By the time that was done, he was drenched, and because it was near morning, he chose not to try to go back to sleep. Instead, he sat up until dawn, listening to the howl of the wind and thinking about other times. He wished that Starks would be more open with him about what to expect, but he accepted that this might not happen. Starks was close-mouthed and reticent, and Paxson believed the man pretty much preferred his own company. That he had taken as much time with the Highlander as he had at their initial meeting seemed surprising in retrospect. He found himself thinking of his family and home. He had been back only once since coming to Paranor, in spite of his promises to his sister and mother, a fact he found troubling. He could argue that he had been too busy with his training, which was admittedly demanding, but the truth was that he had chosen to stay away. Going back before he had accomplished something worth talking about didn't feel right, and to date, that hadn't happened. Perhaps after this journey was over, and he had helped retrieve the magic they sought, he would make another visit. Perhaps. When dawn arrived, the storm departed, moving eastward. The winds died, and the temperatures dropped enough that the humidity faded. Starks, Paxton, and the troll ate their breakfast, released the mooring lines, and set out anew. They flew through the better part of the day, crossing the turfing to the Roxburgh Mountains, and finally descended into the Wilderun and the frontier town of Grimpen Ward. They landed some distance away from their destination, choosing a spot within the forest where the ship wouldn't be likely to be found. Stark shed his black robes in favor of woodsman's garb, similar to what Paxton was wearing, and then the two set out on foot. Twilight was approaching, and the shadows cast by the trees were lengthening, absorbing the fading splashes of sunlight. The woods felt empty and watchful, its eyes those of creatures that made their homes there. They found a footpath that took them a short distance to a road. From there, they could just make out the outlying cabins and sheds of Grimpen Ward's residents, ramshackle affairs with no sign of life. The road they followed was empty until they neared the main part of the town, where the first of the taverns spilled its patrons out one door and on to the next, while new patrons pushed their way inside, and women from the pleasure houses called out to them from the doorways and windows of their workplaces. A few dogs roamed the streets and alleyways as they made their way through the town, and carts and horses passed them by in a rumble of wheels and a clopping of hooves. Beggars came at them from everywhere, and pitchmen from more exotic shows called out their promises, wild and tempting. Come see, come experience. Paxton glanced everywhere at once, while Starks looked at nothing but the road ahead. When they reached the crossroads, marking the town center, Starks brought them to a halt, then moved out of the road to an opening between two buildings, and stood with his back to the wall. "Keep your eyes open," he said to Paxton. Then he closed his own, and for long minutes was very still. When he opened them again, there was a hint of confusion on his face. "I'm picking up on more than one form of magic. That shouldn't be." "You can tell where it's coming from?" Paxton wanted to know. "In general, I can sense the residue. The two are close to each other. Maybe they are even the same, reflecting different uses. In any case, we are not near them. They are all the way on the other end of the town." He glanced about, looking up to the sky. "We should go before it gets any darker." They set out anew, maneuvering their way through the growing crowds, keeping to themselves, trying to avoid unwanted encounters. It was difficult to make headway, the streets filling quickly with the approach of nightfall, and the air pungent with the promise of nighttime pleasures. Sometimes they were accosted, but Starks gently moved those who stopped them away with a touch of his fingers to his lips and a small twisting gesture. Eventually, they reached the far end of the town, the buildings just beginning to give way once more to the forest, lights in windows and street lamps brightening with the coming of darkness. Starks slowed as they reached a tavern whose sign announced it as the Mudland Rose. "This is where we want to be," he said to Paxton. "The magic is close by, but we will have to sniff it out. I will ask the questions, and you will watch my back. If anything looks awry, anything at all, tap me on the shoulder. Don't hesitate. If there is another magic hunter inside, we don't want to be caught off guard." Paxton nodded. With Starks leading the way, they pushed through the double doors and entered the tavern. Inside, it was a madhouse. Men and women were crowded up against one another, shoulder to shoulder, with barely space to move about. The room was cavernous and so dark and smoky that Paxton could not see into the murky corners and higher spaces at all. Patrons stood 3 deep at the serving bar, and all the tables were filled. The laughter and shouting were deafening. Starks took a quick look around, then began maneuvering his way toward the end of the counter, where the serving girls were gathering tankards of ale on trays to carry to the tables. Paxton followed, trying to stay close. It required considerable effort, but they eventually reached their destination. Starks immediately bent to the closest server and whispered in her ear. She went white, nodded slowly, and did not turn to look at him. Instead, she mouthed something Paxton couldn't hear, picked up her tray, and swiftly went about her business. Starks moved deeper into the crowd, Paxton following in his wake, using him as a buffer against the crowd. Although he was repeatedly jostled, he kept his feet and stayed close, scanning the crowds, taking in everything, thinking he might see something that mattered. And then he did. At the very back of the room, a tall figure, cloaked and hooded, rose from a table and went out through the back door. 2 others sitting with him, thicker of build and heavily muscled, moved in front of the door and stood blocking it. "Starks," Paxton hissed, tapping him hurriedly on the shoulder. The Druid glanced back at him, followed his gaze, and nodded. "How many others?" "Only one that I saw. They went out through the door just ahead of those 2. I can't be certain, but it looked like..." He let the rest hang, so uncertain his eyes had not deceived him. He didn't want to finish the thought. Starks was already moving anyway, making for the door and the men guarding it, no longer evidencing even a trace of the careless disinterest that had marked his earlier behavior aboard the ship. Paxton started to reach for a sword, but the patrons of the tavern were packed together so tightly that he couldn't find space to maneuver. Starks wasn't waiting anyway. He came up to the men without slowing, felled one with a fist that shimmered with blue fire as it connected, and stunned the second with a bolt of that same fire, flung from his hand in a brilliant flash. Both men went down, and Starks was past them, and out the door to the yard behind the tavern, Paxton at his heels. In the next instant, a shock wave of black light exploded into them, throwing them back against the rear wall of the tavern. Starks was leading, so he took the brunt of the strike and lay motionless on the ground. But Paxton was only momentarily stunned, and he came back to his feet, swiftly drawing the sword of Lee as he did. Another flash of fire exploded toward him, but this time Paxton caught it on the edge of his black blade and shattered it into harmless fragments. In the dying light, he saw that the attack had come from a stable set out behind the tavern at the end of the lot. A smallish structure with a handful of stalls and a maintenance shed. He also caught a glimpse of two figures crouched within the shed's entrance. Then everything went dark again, and Paxson was forced to wait until his vision adjusted. Crouched in the night's gloom, aware of Starks unmoving behind him and the figures ahead, waiting, he held his ground, ready for a fresh attack. When he could see again, the entrance to the stable was empty, and the figures were gone. He advanced warily, thinking it might be a trap, but when he reached the building, he could tell it was deserted. There weren't even any horses in the stalls. He was about to go back to Stark's when he noticed the dark bundle in a corner at the rear of the structure. Casting a quick look around, he went over for a closer look and found a boy, perhaps 18, his hands and feet bound and his body badly mutilated. It looked as if he had been cut and burned repeatedly. His eyes were wide and staring, and his mouth was stretched as if trying to scream. He must have died in the midst of whatever torture he was enduring. Paxson found and lit a lamp and begged close to the boy. Blood stained the ground surrounding the body, and he could make out the markings of strange boot prints. Federation issue, Stark said, bending close. He was back on his feet, but one side of his face and body were heavily singed. But these were people who knew magic, not common soldiers. That boy was subjected to a lot of pain, both internal and external. They wanted something from him, and I would be surprised if they didn't get it. The magic that we were hunting? That for certain. But I think they wanted something else. Something that wasn't so tangible. Perhaps an explanation for how he found the magic, or how he learned how to use it, or where he heard of it. He looked at Paxson. How many of them did you see? 2. The one who left the tavern ahead of us, and a second who must have already been out here waiting. What's going on? Did both forms of the magic you sensed earlier belong to those 2 men? Or did one belong to whatever talisman the boy was hiding? I'm not certain. At least one form of magic was what killed this boy, so we know that much. To know anything more, we would have to find the men who did this. If they were men. Paxson stared at him. If they were men? What else would they be? Were they dealing with some other form of creature? Let's go after them, he said abruptly. Maybe we can still catch them. Starks gave him a look. Maybe they would like that. Then he shrugged. Let's do it anyway. They set out at once. Stark seemed to know where he was going. His head lifted, his eyes peering through the darkness as if he could see beyond it. They went at a fast trot, heading farther outside the town, in the opposite direction from which they had come, following a narrow pathway into the trees. The shouts and laughters of Grimp and Ward slowly faded away, and the night's stillness grew deep and pervasive. The only sounds now were of their own breathing and footfalls as they ran. Paxson had his sword out, ready for use, fully expecting that he would need it. Starks didn't object. Once or twice, as they were running, Paxson caught sight of a familiar boot print in the soft earth ahead, and he knew they were on the right track. Ahead, the woods opened onto a broad, treeless stretch of pasture, and an airship sat bathed in moonlight on its far side. Two figures were running toward it, and had nearly reached it. "Lee! Lee!" roared Paxson, caught up in the moment, and with a sudden burst of speed, he raced right past Starks in an effort to catch the fleeing men. He should have used better judgment. Ordinary men would have offered no threat to him from this distance, but magic users were another story. They turned, and the entire pasture lit up with explosions of green fire. It had the look and feel of an attack by flash rips and fire launchers, and Paxson was suddenly dodging this way and that to avoid being struck. He heard Starks calling out to him from behind, but he was too busy trying to stay alive to respond. One of the men abandoned the attack and scrambled aboard their two-man, powering up the diopsin crystals and preparing to lift off. Paxson ran harder, close enough now that he thought he could launch his own attack. But in the next instant, he was struck by a powerful blow that lifted him off his feet and threw him backward, his clothes on fire, his ears ringing. He collapsed, still clinging to his sword, fighting to stay conscious. An instant later, Starks was bending over him, smothering the fire with a sort of dry mist that spilled from his fingers. Paxson gasped for breath and tried to sit up, hearing the sound of the airship ascending into the night sky. "Stay where you are," Starks ordered, pushing him down again. "It's too late now. They've gone." "What were you thinking, anyway?" "I just thought they might panic, and I could catch them," he gasped. "Stupid, I know." The Druid felt carefully along his arms and legs and torso. "No harm done, apparently. But don't ever do that again, or it will be your last outing with the Druids. Am I understood?" Paxson nodded. "Can I get up now?" Starks pulled him to his feet. "At least we know a few things we didn't know before." "We do?" The Druid grinned. "Well, for one, we know you can't readily disengage your brain from your impulses. You have to work on that. I'll tell you the rest on our flight back to Paranor. Come along. Put that sword away, please." Feeling both exhilarated and sheepish, Paxson did as he was told.